All right, so I think everyone is in from the waiting room, so we are going to get started. I'd like to welcome you today. My name is Tori Nagash, and I serve as the Research Initiatives Manager at ACUHO-I. And I am excited for you to be here for our ACUHO-I Endorsed Research Webinar, Supporting College Students After the Death of a Parent. Before we begin, I would like to share briefly about the Endorsed Research Program. A significant focus of the ACUHO-I research agenda is disseminating research about housing and residence life, and the Endorsed Research Program is one way that we work to achieve this. ACUHO-I and the ACUHO-I Research Committee invite endorsed research applications on issues related to campus housing, including those that align with the future of the profession imperative areas. Applications are reviewed as they are received on a rolling basis. If you're interested in learning more about the Endorsed Research Program or other ACUHO-I research endeavors, you can find information under Resources in the Research and Assessment area of the ACUHO-I website. You can always also email research@acuhoi.org with any questions. Lastly, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. The live transcript closed captioning feature is enabled, so you can access subtitles during the webinar. It is going to be recorded, and that recording will be posted on the ACUHO-I YouTube channel. For everyone who registered for this webinar, the recording will also be shared with you by email once it is available. And if you have any questions during the webinar that are technical or need immediate attention, you can put those in the chat. We do also have a Q&A function, and we will be hopefully holding questions until the end, but if there is something urgent, then we can also address that during the session as well. And with that, I will now turn things over to our presenter.
Tori, thanks so much, and good afternoon, folks, or good morning, wherever you might be coming in from. I really do appreciate your time today. My name is Scott Wojciechowski, and I currently serve as the Dean of Student Life at Haverford College outside of Philadelphia. And I have the pleasure of sharing back with a community that has given me so much through just a lot of professional development, but also through an endorsed study with ACUHO-I from my dissertation that was completed about 2 years ago, focused on supporting college students after the death of a parent. And as Tori mentioned, there will be time for questions and some discussion and individual reflection on your own. I know the webinar feature of Zoom sometimes limits the full interaction, but we will make the best possible as if we were in a room learning together. So an outline for our time together today, really looking at some of our learning outcomes. As a result of our time, the participants in today's webinar will reflect on their own personal and professional experience with death loss, sometimes a very difficult topic for folks to think about or discuss, which is really the basis of the importance of this research. Participants will be able to identify challenges faced by parentally bereaved students, so students who have experienced the death loss of a parent. What are some of the challenges those students might be navigating on our campuses or in our residence halls or in our communities? And lastly, student participants will be able to identify at least one change in practice that you can take back to your home institutions and implement, hopefully, to help those students who are navigating a difficult time in their lives. So that's our roadmap for today. Similarly, here's our outline. We'll do a brief introduction in terms of this topic. I'll do a very high literature overview, and we'll also share some of the outlines and the findings from my study for my PhD. And then really, I want to focus on the second half of the presentation, really talking about recommendations for practice at your home institutions, but then also creating space for us to talk about some challenges we might face, or for schools and places that are doing really great work with students who are parentally or bereaved in general, a chance for us to learn from each other too. While I am an expert in this specific topic, I also want to lean on the expertise of the folks that are doing this in the day-to-day and know the value of that. Then lastly, we will wrap up with some questions that folks might have and really talk about ways that this can come in here. So I don't want to necessarily set time limits or be overly rigid in terms of, well, we now need to move on to this section. But with that last third, we will really talk about discussion and any questions we might have as a group. So with that said, I want to share a quote from Hope Edelman, who wrote a wonderful book called After Grief. Also, for folks who are familiar with this research, also wrote a book called Motherless Daughters. And she talks about the elements of risk when it comes to sharing a story, particularly around a death loss. And so, what I want to remind folks today, if you haven't noticed from the title or whatever the preamble to this session, we are going to be talking about death and dying throughout this experience and throughout the research report back. There won't be specifics, there won't be highly sensitive information shared, but I do want to brief folks on that will be the topic we'll be talking about today. And just want to remind you all about the basics of self-care that should you need to step away or step out for a moment, you are perfectly understand to do that. So that's something I would love to help with you all. And so just as a reminder, that's what we are talking about today. Um, One thing I want to talk about, and I think what's important for any researcher and any practitioner, is to understand their positionality and their relationship with the topic. Uh, Author Salbello tells a story about losing a parent is like driving through a plate glass window. You don't know it was there until it shattered, and that it takes years to come that you're picking up the pieces. And so, one thing I want to share that's really important in my story is that I am the son and the grandson of a funeral director. Kind of like My Girl, kind of like 6 Feet Under, from our cultural references in terms of growing up in a funeral home. But here is a young, budding funeral director in second grade. And for the longest time, I thought I was going to go into the family business. But as the situation played out and my life unfolded before me, chose to go into college, study education, thought I was originally going to be a middle school science teacher, but then had so much fun and learned so much in college. That's where I decided my industry would be, and have since been in the business, slightly different than the family business, for a number of years. So, understanding and familiarity and proximity to the funereal service from a very young age. I learned to parallel park in a hearse, which is maybe not the same experience that everyone has, but things that I thought for the longest time everyone's home had dead people in the basement. But it turns out it was just funeral directors. And then also another event in my life that was very formative for me was the loss of my own father. Right before I left for college, actually the day before my high school graduation, after a long battle with cancer. And so, thinking about that in terms of how that event, even being exposed to the funeral business from a young age, was still so formative and left me in my own space to navigate my own grief as I left to go to college at Lehigh University. And I think about the people and the places and the resources that I was able to avail myself of that were so formative for that part of my life. And as an opportunity, thinking about now, as someone in student services and working in a dean of students role, how can I use those life lessons, again, not to project and say, well, this is how it goes, because as we'll see, as you might know, death and grief is a very individualized experience. But this idea that I've walked along a similar road. And so when I think about this, and when I was thinking about my research topic, what can you write on for a number of years? And also, what can you write in an area that would be helpful to a community that matters to you? Those were the really foundational moments that informed my practice and my direction with this study. So I appreciate you being here and an opportunity to share a personal part of my journey. I mentioned earlier this opportunity to have some reflection throughout our process. So I want folks to take a moment to just think about a death loss in your own personal or professional setting. And as you navigated that loss, what were some of the steps you took to steer through that professional or personal death loss? And for folks who are willing to share, if you would like to use the chat, I'd love to share if you have some ideas of some resources or tools or strategies you use to navigate this loss. I'd love to see that, and I will share them back without attribution. So if folks would want to share any part of that, I welcome that opportunity to submit those. Just sharing some of the items that have come in the chat. As a student who lost my dad, I learned a lot, leaned a lot on my professors. From a personal loss of a parent, took significant time away from school and work. An important lesson to take one day at a time. Don't try to make long-term plans. Important to have that reflection time and spend time with loved ones. Understanding the learning experience of that borrowed time that one might have, and in sharing and cherishing moments with parents. Important also to learn how to ask for help or with work tasks, or take time to handle assignments or make arrangements. And so I thank you all for sharing those. You can continue to set those in, but I wanted to position and ask this question at the start of my talk today, to realize that everyone, based just on our biological timeline, folks are going to experience death in some form, and have a proximity to it. And some folks are lucky where they go a very long time without necessarily having that opportunity, or being presented with that learning moment. But there's a chance that some folks are, based on their experience, are more proximal to it and may have to navigate these things at different stages of their development. And for the folks who are working with college students, that's something that, with so much development going on in a traditionally aged college student experience, you think about what this might look like, and every day being a new day, and balancing those expectations, and then you have something that is so colossal being incredibly disruptive. So again, I appreciate you all taking time to reflect and share on that. So want to, again, to no surprise, kind of understanding the universality of death, no matter how awkward it might be, and sometimes our own issues with that occasion, oftentimes in our aversion of thinking about it or talking about it, actually makes life a little harder to navigate. Statistics show from a number of studies that 35 to 44% of college students are within 24 months of a general grief process, oftentimes related to a friend, grandparent, or pet. So loss in some form, there is some proximity of our college students to an event in the last 2 years. Studies have also indicated that higher education institutions, a few of them are prepared to respond to bereaved students. And if they are, they're often compartmentalized or hidden or difficult to navigate. And then also, there are opportunities to learn and grow and train our student affairs professionals and institutions to improve support for our bereaved students. And so again, there is hope, and hopefully a conversation like this in such a heavily attended event is an opportunity to continue that conversation. Another thing, just looking at our literature review, that grief is a multidimensional reaction to loss that involves a variety of physical, psychological, sociological, and spiritual domains. It's a very complex topic. A lot of folks will know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, in the acceptance and the anger and the disbelief. But it actually looks at this very highly individualized experience that I referenced and mentioned earlier, and you most likely have experienced as a highly individualized experience. And oftentimes it has informed by the nature of the death. So how the context, or how sudden or expected after a long illness, what that might be, the context of the situation, and that might be the closeness, or the closeness of the relationship, or the last time those individuals spoke, or exposure to the incident itself. But then also, what's one of the major rudders on this is the resilient skills of the individual. So this is particularly interesting when we talk about traditionally aged college students, as they're learning to navigate resilience, as they're learning to understand new challenges. And some even elementary experiences might be really challenging for them. You think about a major life event like a death, what that might look like, and all of those factors overlaying to really understand how students might be prepared to navigate a loss. In the same way, looking at this optimistically, some growth opportunities. We certainly know about post-traumatic stress, but there's also research with Tedeschi and Calhoun about post-traumatic growth, and these opportunities that, when the situations are right, and we know this in kind of student affairs speak as challenge and support, understanding the way that supportive environments and the engagement with this opportunity give a chance to increase confidence, self-reliance, and persistence. Then Heather Savati-Saib has also done a lot of research on understanding the balance of gains and losses, and looking at this as a true experience and opportunity to assess what might be gained, what might be lost, and help kind of rationally proceed through a grief model. We know that generally bereaved students are affected physically, interpersonally, cognitively, academically, and emotionally. And so we see that show up in academic persistence, retention, and graduation rates. We also see in kind of social adjustment, either in withdrawal or hyperactivity or hyper involvement, and increased use of alcohol or other drugs. And then navigating academic challenges that may be induced by stress or lack of sleep or kind of this dip in academic performance, particularly in the semester of the loss. And we also look at recommendations and challenges that are faced from the literature. Um, the creation of university bereavement centers and unified policies as recommended by Deb Taub and Heather Shavati-Saib in this fantastic guide. New Directions in Student Services, published in 2008, focused on assisting bereaved college students. And then also in that manuscript, talking about grief response training for res life staff and faculty who are often going to be on the front line and recipients or be with students at the time of that news being delivered or learned, ways to think about that. And spoiler alert for our recommendation section, it's actually not much more than we actually do in creating a caring, empathetic, listening environment. So throughout all of this literature that exists, there's a lot of research on different types of loss, but not necessarily looking at students who experience the death loss of a parent. Um, it's often mentioned, or it's often maybe not looked at that specific relationship, but in a meta-analysis conducted in 2002 of about 30 studies around college student bereavement, none of those studies actually included a specific focus on parental relationships or parental death loss in the area studied. And really, over the course of the last 36 years, there's only ever been 6 studies, at least in my extensive scouring of dissertation databases and published articles, that have really focused specifically on parent loss and parental bereavement for college students. And we understand this in terms of the impact of the loss of a parent is a disruption of a support system for a student, both from an emotional and financial perspective. Understanding that oftentimes in cooperation with families, supporting students through the financial aspect of that, but also if there are now shift in responsibilities for students to support their families, it changes the dynamic in their ability to really focus on being a student. And so that's how we see the impact on persistence and retention and degree pursuit, and also if that of just in any financial aid or support for the student. And I will share this, the research that I conducted started in 2003, or excuse me, 2023, as we were exiting the most active stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what I wanted to do in that larger context, understand the proximity that students had to death loss, maybe not just their parent, but with such a large global event, that was something that really contextualized our experience of our students during that time. And so that all goes to say led to the purpose of my study was to expand the research and understanding of the impact of the death of a parent on college students and look to identify patterns and support opportunities for student affairs practitioners and other helpers by building on a conceptual framework that incorporates theories related to grief and loss with the student development lens. And really the understanding that we also want to diversify the voices in here. As you can imagine, a lot of the voices and a lot of the research are conducted in a very Western and a very white environment with our college students. So oftentimes voices of marginalized populations are not necessarily included or not brought to the fore. And so that was one thing I hoped at the start of my research, is to include a more diverse narrative of students who have experienced the death of a parent, and ultimately return back to the service of the field ways that we can improve our support for students. So that led to the formation of my research questions, really one big question with 2 sub-questions, really finding the stories about our students who experience the death loss of a parent while they're enrolled in college, and looking at the resources that the students use to navigate their loss, and also what are better ways that institutions can respond to the needs of their parentally bereaved students. So I will not go because this is not a dissertation defense, and that is long behind me. I will touch briefly just on some methodology and methods that were used in the study. And a couple slides coming up, I have a QR code for you to scan. If you would like to read my dissertation in full, you can do that. But again, this is not a crash course on the methods of it, but more just some understanding in terms of the study. So using a qualitative phenomenological approach and narrative inquiry as the method to understand the stories of our students and really positioning the student who experiences the phenomenon, the death of their parent, as the unit of understanding and how they are the experts of that experience and how they tell that story. And I mentioned earlier about the diversification of this narrative. That actually was informed in the population of how we recruited students for the study, that they were enrolled at the time of the death loss of their parent, and the way we defined parent in the sense that it wasn't necessarily only bound by a biological sense, but really widened the definition of parent to be someone who served as a parental figure or someone that is a fictive kin or chosen family member. So this could be, again, someone who might not be of direct genetic or blood relation, but someone who is serving in the role of a parent for an individual who was in college at that time. The sampling and recruitment really looked at purpose of sampling to build out the participants in this. And again, the amount of work and the years that I've worked in this field serving as a member of our care team at the institutions I've worked at before, I could do a convenient sample, could talk to students that I've helped kind of navigate this experience, but that was not the purpose of this. I did not want to influence that pool too much and actually just have it be a feedback session on services me or my institution had provided, but really wanted to look outside of experiences of students from other institutions in a variety of places in terms of what that looked like. So because of that, really worked on referrals, working through residence life staff and deans of students and other individuals in ways that we could recruit students for this study. So using our local listserv in the New England region for deans and advisors to see if there are any students who might meet the participation qualifications of this, working with Tori and having a great partnership with ACUHO-I to be shared and using their database to share out the invitation to administrators and practitioners in case they knew of any students who might participate. And then also working with Heal Grief Incorporated and the parent company of Actively Moving Forward, which is a fantastic app and community-based organization that may have some chapters on campuses that are here today as ways to reach out to students who have been affected in the recent timeline of the study and would be interested in talking about it. So just again, brief overview of the process. That call for referrals occurred from early May to late August 2023. 15 respondents originally completed my informed consent. I interviewed in the first interview 11 participants, 10 of whom actually qualified to advance in the study. And then from there, 9 of the 10 of the initial participants were able to schedule and complete a second round interview. I mentioned the QR code to the dissertation and the tiny URL link if you'd like to read the dissertation in full. I'll also have this on the end slide too, so if you don't catch it now, we'll catch it at the end. But included in the study were semi-structured interviews with open-ended question. The questions in the left-hand side of box was asking the participants how they gave them the opportunity to choose their own pseudonym for the study, learning about their home and college life, the nature of the death of their parent, the immediate impact of that on them, and also some general demographics of where they were, what their major was, things that would be helpful to understand in terms of the identity dimensions that possibly influence this. And then the second interview was looking at really questioning support and resources in both the reality of what was experienced and also what if this were an ideal situation, what do you wish you had? And also balancing being a student at the time while navigating their grief and also the changes that they wish they had made or advice they would give to students going through a similar experience. And after that, all the interviews were transcribed, coded, and then member checked and sent back to the participants to make sure that what I heard and what I interpreted from our conversations were actually representative of their experience. This is just a brief table of all of the participants, the individuals, the pseudonyms they chose, the parent they lost, the cause of the death, how old they were at the time of loss, where they were in the year of school, the identities that they shared with me that they considered as salient or important to them at that time. I also wanted to see if they were the first generation or first in their family to attend college, and maybe how that has an influence on their experience. And it also shows the last column where they were at the time of the study, if they were continuing to pursue their study, if they were taking time away, or if they had graduated and completed their studies. This slide shows a little bit of where those participants fell in terms of the academic sequence. Mentioned earlier, one of the influences of navigating grief is resilience and exposure. And we know as student affairs practitioners that students who may be a little bit farther along in their college journey might have deeper skills and understanding in terms of persistence and resource reliability. And so you see, I wanted to see if that mapped out onto someone who might experience the death loss of a parent in the first year of college, first semester, versus someone who was on the eve of their graduation, and what just their awareness of campus resources or local resources may have had a more positive influence on their experience. And so part of my coding, this just shows you some of the method behind the madness in terms of the trends that were mentioned in all of the interviews and where those themes started to emerge. And this was my scorecard, for lack of a better word. You see the codes and the themes that emerged, both in kind of what was said and the topics that they brought up, how that fits into larger themes, and then also which of the participants shared that as part of their interviews. And this is then what I used after all the coding, and I'll spare you those details, led to my findings. So just showing my work on the back end for y'all. In looking at this, really seeing the three major themes that emerge from the research. Looking firstly at the impact of the death loss. So the participants reported that they had worsened academic performance and decreased motivation. Sometimes it was a very blurred grief process, shock and numbness. And I want to again contextualize this, that most of this was from spring of 2020 through almost up to the spring of 2023, when we were still in the haze of COVID and restrictions and limitations of going to a funeral home or participating in grief rituals around mourning and death. Avoidance, focusing on other things, distractions, difficulty managing tasks and priorities, and then lack of awareness of the barriers to institutional support. And all of this, actually, this sounds similar to the literature overview because it was mirrored in this process. Similarly, from the resource and support angle, what was helpful for students was helpful check-ins and adjustments, either talking to their faculty and leaning on them to say, hey, this is what happened, help me understand this, or is there any flexibility? A chance that growing closer to families or significant others, changing in financial aid or institutional financial support, students who availed themselves of a therapy through counseling services on their campuses or in their local communities. And then actually there was a theme in the conversation with the students I spoke to, using this call or this experience to increase their drive and their commitment to graduating and fulfilling a dream of their parents. In addition to seeing this mirrored in the literature, very similar to the chats that you all shared earlier from your initial reflections. So you see some similarity in that experience. And then looking again, where are those gaps, where are the things we're looking at? What do students wish they had had? Connections with peers in similar situations. A centralized notification and coordinated response. Some of the participants talked about, I felt like I was tired of telling the story over and over and over again. And I didn't know who wanted to know. I don't know how it would be received. Because of that, I kept it to myself. And so we see that with students who experience some form of negative or traumatic experience, the kind of continued victimization or re-victimization in that sense of like having to repeat multiple times an experience that was not favorable. And so what are ways that we can be more thoughtful about intake for these students? Then lastly, they wish they had some clearer processes and greater flexibility with regard to taking incompletes in courses or navigating a leave from the college and then eventually a reentry to that college community. Again, this is all within the context of a global pandemic. So thinking about what life was like not too long ago with distancing and remote learning and other things like that. But similarly, this maps onto, much like the literature and the reflections from some of the participants in today's webinar, this matches into that overarching research question and then my two sub-questions in terms of what that looks like for recommendations in moving forward. So here we go into the part of some of the recommendations that come out of this that are either unique to this study or are amplifications of previous recommendations from the literature. It's important to really think about increased campus-wide grief trainings. I mentioned earlier a general aversion to talking about death and talking about loss. I will say that in the last 5 to 10 years, we've had a lot of shows and movies and books that really address it head on. And so I think we are becoming a more grief literate society. We still have work to do, but I think that there's an opportunity that we realize that just holding this in or bottling it up is not the way forward. But what are ways that our campus communities can really be receptive to and sensitive to students who might be grieving or navigating a death loss? And so really expanding on those recommendations from the new directions in student services, there's a really great chapter in that book, in that manuscript, talking about training faculty and residential staff. And really it looks at the referral recommendations, it's being present, it's making space to listen and not, validate the feelings of the students and realize that you're not the expert and make that referral. And I think sometimes we get so apprehensive that we are worried that we might not say the right thing, or we feel that we have to empathize, and then we become the person that the individual who has experienced the loss now has to be another person they have to comfort. What I would recommend, and this is, Student Affairs 101, is just show up and be present and be there. And sometimes that's the most important thing that you have to do and can do for a student who's navigating this loss. One goal is to become a grief-informed campus that normalizes grief and shows that there is no one way to grieve, highly individualized experience. Also, one of the steps of Deb Taub and Heather Servati-Saib's recommendations is to have a referral elsewhere. Oftentimes, our colleagues in a counseling center are going to be generalists that are able to receive that referral, but making sure that if there is a specialty or there's an individual on campus who does specific grief work, might that be a person that could be a more targeted referral as opposed to well, just go talk to CAPS or go to the counseling center, thinking about ways that that can help. Also, it's helpful, again, that direct connection either to a counseling professional or a member of a campus care team, instead of oftentimes we sit on that information and don't know how to share that, ways to fully enact and enable a wide system of support. And then from that, if a student is included on a care team or is on someone's radar, whether it be an RA or a hall director or another student staff member or student affairs staff member, periodic check-ins just to say, hey, just checking on you, not like you should be at this point on your grief journey. It's not about that, but just this reminder that someone's there for them and that here are the resources and steps forward should they need them. Another opportunity, because of the awkwardness of death, how do we widen this scope as much as possible for students to have a highly visible resource website that talks about that? So that's for your students who might be commuting or not live on campus, or for non-traditional students who are experiencing this but don't know where to go. So if they were to enter into a Google search, your institution and bereavement or your institution in grief, might this be picked up and an opportunity for them to have resources at their fingertip that don't necessarily rely on an interpersonal interaction? And thinking about that in terms of our robust systems of care, how do we do this as a one-time report? And from there, the registrar is notified, the student's advisor is notified, financial aid is notified. If there is an emergency fund or a crisis fund exists, an opportunity for soft outreach from that organization or that process. So to limit the burden of the student navigating all of these grief practices, planning a funeral, attending a service, spending time with family, this is something that can happen in the background in a supportive way that allows them to have all of those items presented to them as opposed to them having to hunt them down themselves. And again, that's something you think about in terms of good practice for everyone. Think about lessening barriers and improving access for all of our students, maybe not just the ones who are navigating a death loss. And then, students who did share and the participants in the study talked about the importance of counseling and talking through it with a therapist, but then also looking for connection and finding other individuals who might be walking a similar road. Again, highly unlikely it's going to be the exact experience that they had, but at least for someone to say, yeah, I know that feeling. Because this is an incredibly isolating experience and you don't know who to talk to. And again, you keep it inside and it only just festers. So thinking about counseling opportunities in a grief or a grief group setting, or referrals to local organizations or online communities, again, like the Heal Grief Actively Moving Forward app that allows students to connect with a variety of communities really across the globe, both on the type of loss, when it occurred, and then ways that they can really navigate the various levels of grief and bereavement. So thinking about, again, the wide resource of support offered to students in terms of what might be out there. So that is the content I want to share with you all, but really open this up for questions and or comments. And so before we get into the broad questions, another reflection point I want to share with you all. What are some good practices that you've observed and some challenges that your institution might face? So I know it's a double loaded question, but I want to give an opportunity to one, identify some good practices that are out there, but also maybe name some of the challenges that we might face. And so Tori I believe, can help me. If you would like to come off mute, you can raise your hand and we can empower your speaking privileges. If you feel more comfortable entering your comments in the chat, you are more than welcome to do so. But I want you to think about, again, some good practices that might be happening at your home institutions, or also one thing that you might be up against at your place.
All right. I see Ebony Edwards has raised a hand, so I believe you should have permission to speak now.
Yes, thank you. Some good practices that I have observed at our institution is that the sensitivity training seems to be very in-depth, and it allows for working in residence life, for example, for people to be able to assess the needs of the students when loss comes up. But a challenge I would say that we face is being able to get them connected to the right resources in a timely fashion. That would be the only thing. We have great resources here. We have great resources for them following up maybe on a weekday, but on weekends it might be a little challenging. And you can never really schedule death. You can't really schedule
Right.
loss, and you really can't schedule grief. So I would say that it's something that a lot of institutions face, but it is something that I'm hoping that we can kind of work through for the most part.
Ebony, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. And you're spot on. And I think you could train as best you can, but then also when you tag into that machinery or that workflow that exists, yeah, how do you? In the point you made, the timeliness of it, and what is if students have to travel to go home, or it's something that they kind of need to drop everything, what it might be. How can we be most responsive to that need? So thank you for sharing. Really appreciate that.
Looks like James has also raised a hand.
So, hi, first of all, thank you so much for not only the work you're doing, but also generally for ACUHO-I for having this webinar. But I would say one of the challenges I faced in my own personal experience. So my dad passed suddenly junior year of college, and it was like 3 weeks out from final season. And one of the challenges that I had was the overall impersonal and sterile processes that took of, okay, my dad just died. Now I have to submit all this paperwork just to try and take a break, take a breather from school. So I feel like that's one of the challenges that I'd say probably is at a lot of institutions is how do we gather that necessary information so we can tell students, yes, you can take this break, you can put a pause on your classes, it can be paused until like the next semester you have time without making it so sterile and hounding for information like where is the death certificate? Oh, this doesn't work. Can you send us a different copy? Things
Right.
like that.
Yeah. James, thank you for sharing, and sorry for your loss. And I think that that's something as you mentioned, kind of that navigation in the business of death, right? There's a lot of things that, depending on the familial role, might be involved in that planning, but then also any other hat or any other role that that student finds themselves in is one of like a clerk, almost taking the paperwork from place to place and getting it all signed off. Meanwhile, you're still in it. The sensitivity of that moment is really challenging. So it is both how do we have systems that exist, but then also how do we personalize them and how do we make them accessible in a way that it's not actually introducing more harm to the process, and introducing a level of doubt. We need the death certificate. Well, the obituary is not enough. We need the death certificate. And where's the flexibility or the breadth of that acceptable documentation for this? Thank you for sharing.
I think there might be something in the chat.
Okay, right. I just saw this comment. So thank you, Tori. I appreciate you. Chat submission. I'm going to read it. My dad died during my sophomore year, which happened to be my first year because I transferred from another institution. I felt super supported by my dean and my professors, which I was so grateful for. I wish I had more support in learning how to navigate friendships and peer relationships while grieving. For example, I went home for a couple of weeks. When I came back, I had peers in class who asked me where I'd been. It'd been hard to navigate that situation, especially because it often happens at the start of a class, and I wasn't prepared to explain. So thank you for sharing. And that's exactly, again, navigating all of those relationships and who might have a need to know and what that might look like. And also, you might get tired of it. So we find other ways to soften it and it doesn't resurface it each time. And that's something where there's no perfect answer. I want to share that we are in pursuit of getting as perfect as possible, but because of the individualization of the process, understanding what that might look like. But again, thank you all for sharing your experience. One question I have for this group before we open it up to any general questions about the process is, in pursuit of our learning outcomes, in the offer I shared to be with you all here today, I want you to think about one change that you might apply at your institution. And this could be introducing a form of sensitivity training or mentioning death loss as a topic that might come up on a duty rotation or a referral to the on-call staff member. Or it might be, hey, we can look at this to think about how our care team might network with a number of offices on campus to streamline a process of notification and outreach in kind of one person, whether it be a case manager or be kind of the death specialist on a team that does that outreach and help students navigate that specific area. So take a moment to think about one change that you might take home from our time together this afternoon, back to your home institution, either in your personal or your professional practice. Folks are welcome to share. You don't have to. This is a challenge by choice. But I just wanted to create this reflection moment in our time together. A colleague that shared, my advising staff participates in training for mental health first aid, but I'd like to add some training specifically for bereaved students. Thanks, Steph. I appreciate you sharing that. one of the last things I want to share with this group before we open up for any broader questions is, a quote from David Kessler, who was a protege of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And he talks about each person's grief is being as unique as their fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, we all share that need for grief to be witnessed. And so I really am so grateful for you all for taking time out of your day to join us and be in community to talk about this very important topic in ways that we as a community approach it, and learning maybe not just from direct experience, but from that of our students or our colleagues, in ways we can better be prepared for the eventuality of a situation like this. And so that we're not caught off guard, we're ready to be there and be present and turn down as much as we can so that we can be fully present in a great moment of need. And so again, thank you for taking the time to be here. One, to support this topic, support me along this journey. I see a lot of friends, colleagues, and folks who have been big cheerleaders for this work, and also some colleagues who are doing this really meaningful work on your home institutions. So I'm grateful for that community that has made this possible. So with that said, an incredible debt of gratitude to Tori and the ACUHO-I team, who were so crucial for my recruitment of my participants and being a home professional organization for me. I mentioned earlier the QR code and the tiny URL to the full dissertation is here should you want to read it or zoom into those specific methodologies or areas that I very loosely touched on this afternoon. And with that said, let's open up for any questions. Question we got in the chat: do you believe there's anything in your research that might differ now that we're more removed from COVID and the pandemic? That's a great question. I think that, at least thinking from my participants, in terms of some of them, because of the time of their parent's death, their actual grief process and the kind of ritual around grief was interrupted and severely limited. So I don't know how transformative or how disruptive, or the degree to the disruption, because I think it would still not alleviate kind of the pain and the navigation of that grief. But I think that it would certainly have removed a barrier or removed an ability for students to wrestle with it and be there fully. One thing I think that has changed and is important to note is that what we've learned as a field, as an institution of as a industry of higher education, the flexibility of instruction. And I think that as looking at a silver lining of that, the flexibility that was able to be done if folks were remote or were at home and doing their classes online. And so actually were able to be more present with their families or their home communities, but in kind of this post-pandemic life where we have moved to less remote access or removed elements of flexibility that were previously enabled, we lose that benefit too. So I don't want to just say pandemic bad, but I think the things that we learned and maybe have kept or maybe have gotten rid of as a result of kind of exiting pandemic mode is actually maybe not the greatest things. And so that the general flexibility or understanding of the circumstantial things that present themselves to our students, are we actually backsliding a little bit? So I appreciate your question, and hopefully my two-sided answer helps you to think about if you are a policymaker or can influence policy, what that might look like at your home campus. But really great question. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your kind words. Thank you. Maybe time for one more question. Burning question that someone might have. Also, my email is here. If you have any questions that you'd like to follow up with afterward, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'd love to connect and continue this conversation, but we'll give a few moments for one final question if there is one out there. As a former middle school science teacher and someone who works at a Quaker founded institution, wait time and silence are something I deal particularly well with, but I know that might not be the case for everyone. But with that said, I will turn it back over to Tori. And folks, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'd love to continue this conversation. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone. We will be sending out the link to this recording through email, as well as a link to an evaluation for the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, you can always email research@acuhoi.org. Thank you for joining us today.